I'm Monica Johnson, and this is Booklyn Calling. Hello. Welcome to another episode of Booklyn Calling. This is where we talk about artists and libraries and social justice, among other things. Marshall and I are normally your hosts, but today I'm here with Booklyn curator Jan Descartes. She and I are both artists who work at Booklyn Inc., an arts nonprofit located in Brooklyn, New York, on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape people. And we created Booklyn Calling to explore art making as a tool for community engagement and for social change. And we do this by talking directly with artists and activists in the field. And we're also interested in finding out new aspects of material culture and how art interacts with social justice. So today, our fantastic guest is Shana Agid, who is an artist, designer, teacher, and organizer whose work focuses on relationships of power and difference in visual, social, and political cultures. Her books and prints combine image, text, and form to explore these through narratives of desire, landscape, and history. His work has been shown at the New York Center for Book Arts, the Minnesota Center for Book Arts, the Hamilton Woodtype Museum, and other venues. His artist books are in the collection of the Walker Arts Center, New York Public Library, and the Library of Congress, among many others. She is also a collaborative design researcher and practitioner, working with organizations to create systems and infrastructures towards self-determination, and a longtime member of Critical Resistance. Shana is an associate professor at Parsons School of Design, the new school in New York City. And I'm so excited to welcome you, Shana. Hello. How are you today?
Hello, I am so excited to be here. Thank you so much for this invitation.
Let's dive in. I really am interested to know more about Shana, your history with Booklyn. I joined Booklyn's staff in 2018, and of course, our history predates that. I think the origins are dated at like 1999. I would love to know how you first discovered Booklyn or how Booklyn discovered you. And I would love to hear any stories you would want to share about what that was like.
Thanks, Monica. So that's I'm trying to remember how I found out about Booklyn in the first place, and the truth is I do not remember, but probably the internet. But what I can tell you is that I was in my very first year as a college teacher. I had gotten out of a graduate program. I went to California College of the Arts, where I studied with Betsy Davids, and had gone to grad school largely because I really wanted to teach. And an artist friend of mine, Ashley Hunt, essentially said, listen, you should just go make art for 2 years and see if it's what you want to do. So I went and I made art for 2 years, and I stayed for an extra year to do a second degree in visual and critical studies, and decided it was definitely what I wanted to do. And I really, really wanted to be a teacher. And so I got very lucky. The person who I'd actually learned printmaking from, Chris Phillips at Sarah Lawrence College, invited me to come be a guest teacher there for a year when I got out of grad school. And this was back in 2005. And so I taught a couple of classes at Sarah Lawrence, and the structure there is interesting. All classes, or the majority of classes, are year long. So you really get to be with students for a long time. And so I taught an intro to artist books class. And I presume, but I'm guessing, that when I was looking for people to come talk to us about books, that I found Booklyn that way. And Jamie Munkachi, I think is how you say Jamie's last name.
Yep.
Jamie came up with like a suitcase on rollers full of books. There was something about what was in that suitcase that Jamie unpacked that was riveting to me. And I'm not exaggerating. It was really like a different way of thinking about these kinds of intersections. of political work that I was, doing in my life around healthcare, HIV/AIDS in particular, and increasingly around prisons and policing, and just these really sort of incredible forms and structures and ways that people were bringing those things together in ways that I really hadn't seen up to that point. Anyway, so Jamie was like, giving the Booklyn spiel. We do this, we do this, we do this. And one of the things she said was that Booklyn represented artists. And I was like, it was like
Mm.
everything I could do not to be like, you do? What? Right? Because I was like trying to be the teacher. So anyway, afterwards, I was like, I heard you say this thing. Is that true? I made this book when I was in graduate school that I would be really interested in. I don't know, just because I had auditioned a book and then didn't have any idea what to do with it because I didn't have any idea what to do with it. And the book that I'd auditioned was this book called Snitch. And it's a screen printed pop up book about surveillance. And so Jamie gave me Marshall's contact information. And I reached out to Marshall. I think I emailed him and I didn't hear back. And I emailed him again and I didn't hear back. But eventually he wrote me back and was like, fine, if you want to show me the book, like come to Greenpoint. I went to Greenpoint to Old Pencil Factory. And I came in and I showed him the book, and he looked at it. And I was like just praying none of the mechanisms would like break while he was looking at it. And he made it through the whole book. Nothing broke. And at the end, he was like, I really wasn't going to get back to you because I hate pop-up books. He was like, but this is great. This was really great. And like, I think right there and then he was, and he talked, as Marshall does, about like essentially sort of the political tone of the book. The book tries through pop-up in a lot of artists at the time in the late 90s, early 2000s were making work that kind of subjected people who might not normally be subjected to surveillance. What I was interested in was having the viewer think about what surveillance did for them in terms of securing the power of whiteness, the power of being a gentrifier, the power of essentially the power of observation in order to secure class and race and sort of gender and sexuality status. And so what the book was trying to do was use these pop-up mechanisms to force the viewer into this position of being the person doing the surveillance. And to not be able to step away from that and the questions that created. And so that started a sort of conversation with Marshall about the value and importance of politics and of organizing and activism through artist books as a form.
I love that story. It's so it makes perfect sense, and it also sounds like who I've come to know as my colleague and my friend Marshall Weber as well. When he gets it, and sometimes he just takes a little moment to get there. I'm also surprised, I have to say, and I am indirectly talking directly to you, Marshall Weber, as you listen to this at some point. I am surprised that with all of our observations about artist books being children's books for adults, which we are sure to say at least one time in every podcast, why pop-up books wouldn't have an instinctive register. But that's a conversation for another podcast, I think. And also, I'm looking online. We do have Snitch on our website, and we'll be sure to include that in the show notes. And I see also that it was distributed to 17 different institutional collections. And among them, I see like Harvard, Stanford, Oberlin, Bucknell, University of Miami, Walker Art Center, University of Southern California. So Marshall was certainly not alone in appreciating your work.
Thank you. And I will say too that one of the things that I learned from that first conversation, and I ended up having this relationship with Marshall and with Felice for a long time, and since I think with Jan and with Belden, just this experience of being a Booklyn artist where you get to talk about work in progress. Like clearly Snitch was not in progress at that point. It was done and I was, in the process of trying to edition it. But I now, when I make books, I have this like secret in my back pocket that when I get to a place where I'm like, I don't know what choice to make about this. And I need to think about this as something that is both about the material and the idea of the book, but also about what's sort of viable so that something is not so fragile, for instance, that it can't be used and used a lot. Like those kinds of things, I think, are some of the kind of amazing conversations that I've been able to have with the curators and folks at Booklyn over the years since that time.
So, two of your recent books, Park Factors, which is an accordion fold book with a removable spine, and Ground Rules, an accordion fold book that has 3 sections, involve the passing of your mother. Call a Wrecking Ball to Make a Window is a map book that tracks your movements in New York City alongside that of the artist, writer, and activist David Wojnarowicz, which also involves his absence. Also looking through works, earlier works such as The Disappearance of Philip Divine, which also involves a passing and an absence. Would you be able to talk about the role of loss in your work?
Jan, that question's amazing. And I hadn't really thought about how present death is in my work, even like before this very obvious moment of the more recent pieces about my mom. Okay, so I actually want to talk about The Disappearance of Philip Divine for a second, since you brought that in. And that was a piece that I made. It's a screen print. It's just a simple 2-color screen print. And I made it actually just after I finished that graduate degree I was talking about before. And I had written my master's thesis about representations made of high profile killings of folks of color and queer people in particular that are generally referred to as hate crimes. And some of my political organizing, most of my political organizing at this point, is working to abolish the prison industrial complex. And in doing that, one of the things that I grapple with, that movement grapples with, is how to address or prevent harm. And in particular, one of the things that I wrestle with, that both as a person in the world and I guess as an organizer, is this really complicated mix of the kinds of violence that happen against people through sort of the enforcement of white supremacy and patriarchy and other things, and how we can address those in ways that don't just kind of rely on systems that also uphold white supremacy and patriarchy and heteronormativity and the rest. And part of my thinking when I was working on that master's thesis was about the visual culture that gets produced in relationship to these really high profile murders. And one of the things I looked at was the films that had been made in relationship to the murder of Brandon Teena, who was a young trans man who was raped, and then when he reported the rape, later murdered by people who had been his friends. And when he was killed, he was with 2 other people. And one of those people, Philip Divine, was also a young person, a young Black man who was on the scene when the people who killed Brandon Teena, who are now infamous for killing Brandon Teena, came to the house. And when the movie Boys Don't Cry was made, which starred Hilary Swank as Brandon Teena, the makers of the film decided that it was too complicated to figure out how to explain who Philip Divine was and the narrative arc of the story. So they just cut him out. But what struck me was the sort of overlap between what sort of quickly became a kind of acceptable, tragic representation of this white trans guy, and what was required to be removed from that story to make it acceptable in that way, and what was created and made present in that story. So if you've not seen Boys Don't Cry, there's a scene where Brandon Teena, who is at that point passing as a man, picks up a baby and everyone's like, all the women are like so surprised that he is like so natural with this baby, right? So there are these like incredibly normalizing moments that are meant to sort of raise this question of his gender. So all of this is to say that print, The Disappearance of Philip Devine, was me trying to think about how do we produce stories, and especially where there are overlapping issues around oppression and privilege. How do we end up producing stories that reproduce one particular way of thinking about sort of the order of the world and how things ought to be or how things might be? And how do the lives often of white people get privileged in the way those stories get told? And I think that last piece is sort of a theme of my work. And I should say here that I am white. I grew up middle class. I'm trans identified and queer. And that for me, being able to be a person who works for liberation means being able to think about how to orient to all of those pieces of my own identity and also understand the ways that those privileges function in my own life, and how that impacts visual culture has been a really big part of my work. I think that it's become intensely personal in moments. And Jan, I guess this maybe is a way of trying to answer the question you actually asked about absence and loss, which is that I don't know, but my best guess is that the stories both of my own family have been deeply shaped by loss and absence, by stories of people that are unknown or untellable. And then my own kind of just coming up in the world. I came out as queer when I was 14. It was the very early 90s, and I came out into a world where everyone around me was sick and dying. And it just deeply shaped my understanding of what is at stake in politics and in identity. And I think it also created a kind of importance to the ways that we build relationships that actually sustain us in the world.
Shana, I just want to say thank you for sharing all that. And I said this before we started. I'm always thinking of ways to have clarifying questions, and I feel like just listening to you a little bit longer, you have clarified so much to me and create such a strong case for sometimes listening is the best path to clarity. So anyway, I just wanted to thank you for sharing that.
I was thinking a lot about how the absence is also creating this presence, which I think is really beautiful in your work. And then I was thinking a lot about your work with prison abolition and how that is also addressing absence and loss in folks' lives. And I wondered, how does prison abolition kind of fit into the work that you make?
As you were talking, Jan, I was thinking my friend Emily Drabinski, who was a librarian, said to me many years ago this thing that's never left me. She said, I think we probably really only ever have one or two good questions. We just find ways to ask them over and over again differently. And I feel like this was like a librarian insight that I have been deeply grateful for many, many years, both as an artist and as a teacher, but I think also as an organizer. And I tend to think of my artwork as something that I do in really deeply solitary ways. Like I tend not to do a lot of collaborative work in my artist books work. But I do feel like it's very much in conversation with how it's like a way that I'm trying to make sense of the world, which I guess is what all of us are doing all the time. But I think that to me, one of the most critical pieces of doing the work of prison industrial complex abolition is about recognizing what it is that people make and build and do together to create possibilities for, I think different people name it different things, whether it's safety or freedom, or a capacity to live with peace. But I think that the kinds of questions that I come back to over and over again have to do with how we navigate the troubles of the world without presuming that the only way to live well together is for all those troubles to go away, and really to be more invested in asking really complicated questions in really creative ways. And so to me, like the questions that are at the center of probably all my work, but like call a wrecking ball to make a window, for instance, or I think even park factors and ground rules have to do with like how do we figure out ways of being in the world that are full of possibility without being simple or without denying complexity and mess, and that to me is also very much the work of abolition, right? We know that people make mistakes, we know that people hurt each other, we know all of these things, and I would also argue that we know that that there are structures of power, like I was saying before, racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, etc., that are also sort of built in harm and violence. And so we can't address harm and violence without also addressing those larger systems, and we certainly can't address them through those larger systems. And so I think for me, the overlaps have to do with recognizing that all the kinds of creative work we do in the world have to do with trying to wrestle with these questions and understand them differently, and test things out and try out and try on different ways of doing things. And I mean, one of the things I'm thinking about with Call a Wrecking Ball to Make a Window, which I think of always as having essentially sort of three characters. So there's me, there's David Wojnarowicz, and then there's Manhattan as a kind of third character in that book. And the story of Manhattan came into it because it was too simple for me to keep romanticizing this idea of David Wojnarowicz as a figure, and as a, the way that I entered into that book was trying to think about my own queer desire as a trans person, and where that got complicated along the way for me, especially as I started to appear in the world more and more as someone who passed and read as male, and how that felt like it stripped from me another sort of element of being recognizable as queer, and where that turned in terms of how it started making me think about desire and who looked at me and who didn't look at me, and what was legible and what was not. And in all of that, it became really easy to have this kind of romantic attachment to ideas of queerness that probably haven't actually existed for anyone ever, but especially not for folks who haven't had access to queer community for all kinds of reasons, including, racism and classism. And so for me, it became really important to kind of think about the ways in which Manhattan as a geological space and as a political space and a cultural space could be a way to think about what is always operating behind how we learn how to see one another, how we learn how to talk to one another, and really sort of how we navigate building spaces of freedom, which sounds super cheesy, but I mean it in a very grounded way. And so for me, that meant thinking about the colonial history of the space. It meant thinking about the built history of the space, about the history of war here, and that became a kind of way to understand these kind of massive systems, like these massive systems of things like imprisonment or um, colonization, while also kind of being able to imagine something more intimate and kind, like desire.
Shana, I wonder if you could talk a bit about David Wojnarowicz, just as the person he was, and how you discovered his work, assuming that his timeline looks like ended right around the time I think you were saying you came out. He passed away in 1992 of AIDS, which I think was that around when you were 14 and said that you came out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested to know like where, like what was the intersection and how his biography or his work really grabbed you.
I took this writing class while I was in graduate school with Cooley, and in it, we read In the Shadow of the American Dream, which is the sort of transcribed and edited diaries of Wojnarowicz. And it completely transformed things. And I think it overlapped with a time when I was coming out as trans. It overlapped with a time when I was making some very complicated decisions about my body, and where all of these other things started to unfold. And the diary has in it just stories from his literally walking around the city. And what I ended up doing ultimately, and I made Wrecking Ball later, but what I ended up doing was going through the book and tracing every instance where he talks about moving around the city or in and out of the city. And that became sort of the basis of Call a Wrecking Ball to Make a Window, where I overlapped those stories with my own, and kind of tried to find a way to trace our movements through the city in a way that made it difficult to ascertain whose movements were whose. And this was sort of where that need to be able to problematize and not just romanticize that relationship of my idea of him became so important. But I think what I found out while I was beginning to read him, becoming increasingly obsessed with him, was that when I was 14, I worked at this place called the Pink Zone. We sold T-shirts and postcards and basically anything with a rainbow or a pink triangle on it. And there was a postcard we had on that postcard rack that was, and I write about it in Call a Wrecking Ball to Make a Window, that was a picture of a man running across a map, and the man is on fire. And I was completely taken by it. And I don't know if I just was never smart enough to flip it over and read what it said on the back, but I had no idea that it was made by the artist David Wojnarowicz. But it stayed in my mind forever and ever and ever. And I obsessed over it. And there I was in graduate school going through this, work that had been assigned of his, and I found that image. And so I think it was also the fact that there was this tie in these two different moments in my life of trying to figure out my place in the world, that he just kind of showed up. Um, and so I think, my connection to him is as much about, me making that connection as it is to the way that he ended up writing and thinking and making through a kind of rage in relationship to HIV and AIDS that reminded me of the ways it felt to be harassed as a dyke on the streets, the ways that it felt to watch people getting harmed and violated for being queer, and I identified with that rage as well.
I have another question. If just to go back a little bit, I'm really curious about this friend that you had mentioned and this insight that we only have a few good questions that we ask in our lifetime, and we just find different ways to ask them. That's that feels like a huge anchor. And then looking into the works that Jan was asking about, and I wonder if you could take a stab at what questions those might encapsulate, if there are like a few good questions that you're asking through your work.
I think for me, one of the biggest questions I ask, I've articulated as, what is the trouble of living in a body? And I think there's a lot in my work that is about that question, whether that's about, the ways that I try to think about and understand my mom's body and my mom's relationship to her body and my relationship to her body as she was dying and I was caring for her in that is really a big part of the focus of Ground Rules, or understanding these shifting relationships between bodies and desires and what can and can't be read by other people versus what we see in ourselves that I was talking about with Call it a Wrecking Ball to Make a Window. But I think also grappling with privilege, in my case with whiteness in particular, and the ways that the the whiteness that my body carries inscribes privileges on me that I can do everything in my power to see and understand and interrupt, but that I can't not have that white privilege. And so it's my obligation, I think, to be constantly aware of it and trying to engage it. So to me, that question of, what is the trouble of living in a body um, is like an invitation and also a challenge, and also a little bit of a comfort, because I have and always have had a complicated, uneasy, sometimes super celebratory, but sometimes really difficult relationship to being a body in the world. So that's one. I think another question that I am constantly asking through my work has to do with, feels a little less well formulated, but has to do with this idea of space and how we occupy spaces, and what we build in them with one another. And I think it probably, again, I definitely err on the cheesy side, I think, but I think it has a lot to do with love, and a lot to do with what we do with and for one another, even and maybe especially in the face of the kinds of violence that have, even in my relatively privileged life, really marked my entire life. So that, I remember being a much younger person, identifying as a girl or a woman still at that time, and realizing that people who identified as men and had, been gendered as men didn't think about rape every day, and I did. And like, so I think those kinds of things, like how do we build spaces where that's maybe not not what folks are having to think about, but also like, what does it mean to have that conversation and to have that sort of ground and understanding of difference that is not about, perpetuating like a kind of separation or inevitability of lack of understanding, but actually being able to sit in that and be like, wow, our experiences are really different. And what do we do with that? And I think that a lot of my work is just trying to wrestle with those questions.
It's interesting talking about bodies. If I may read a quote from Call a Wrecking Ball to Make a Window, which is, "The Holland Tunnel breathes regular, like clockwork, like tunnel lungs. Every day since 1927, thousands of cubic feet of soot-strewn air has risen above the tailpipes and windshields, swept up into vents by 84 high-powered fans like jet engines." And it's so interesting mentioning living in a body and that New York City is the third character in Call a Wrecking Ball, because I got this feeling that New York City was this breathing entity allowing us to like come and go within its, I don't know, robot organic self, which felt so present last week when 2 weeks ago when we were going to first record this podcast, but it was, the days when the skies in New York were, yellow and orange with smoke from up north. And I guess I just wanted to, I don't know if this is so much a question, but just commenting that I really got this feeling that New York City was a living body in Call a Wrecking Ball to Make a Window, and that we were interacting with this body, as as the reader, and also maybe as folks living in New York City. I think as I'm reading it, some of the text, as Shana said, engages with New York City. It engages with leaving New York City, and then the structural nature of New York City, and such as the quote, like breathing, like this tunnel is like emitting pollution to allow the folks in the tunnel to not take in that pollution. So it's the lungs allowing these little car beings to exist. And I suppose there is a question there of, do you see New York City as a body? Can you, for Shana, give any words about that, about how New York City is like breathing and allowing movement within Call a Wrecking Ball.
I mean, thank you for reading that. And I learned that about those tunnels, about the Holland Tunnel from quote unquote, I'm gonna call it a research trip that I went on, which was to take the Circle Line cruise around Manhattan. And the cruise guide, I guess, like the person who was, telling us what we were looking at, talked about those tunnels, which I realized I'd always seen, but I'd never really noticed. And I certainly hadn't wondered what they did. And it made me think about, just like what it takes to keep this city alive. Yeah, I think 100%, right? Like, I mean, we know that the island of Manhattan before it was Manhattan was largely trees. And so had its own kind of breathing apparatus and was probably, I don't know enough about this, but I would guess was probably sort of a major kind of lung in its own way for this area geographically. But I think that there's something, I mean, one of the themes I think of that book, and again, maybe like an echoing theme for me, is this idea of how people make lives and keep themselves and the things they love alive. And one of the other sort of components of that book has to do with the idea that New York City is a place where people produce or create or sustain so many different kinds of life all the time. And I mean human life, but not only human life. And I think there's something about New York City that calls for that, right? That requires it. It can be a very hard place to live. But that also almost like compels it, not in a bad way, like produces conditions for life in ways that I think people outside New York City maybe don't see or recognize or know or understand in the same way. And it feels to me like the city, probably any city, but in this instance, our city here, it plays its own role. It feels like a sentient being in that way.
I'm looking at the map and call a wrecking ball to make a window, and it's it's starting to look a little bit like a slab of meat. Of Manhattan, like a leg of a lamb chop or something, and maybe especially, with spaces that are islands and the relationship that our bodies have with, we reverse anthropomorphize ourselves as being islands, like human islands, and thinking about like, we put food in our body, food comes out of our body, and how whether it's like a tunnel going in and out of the city, it's like there are ways to get in and discrete ways to get out, but there's an integrity of the island. And I've been thinking about the what is it called, the Army Corps of Engineers has proposed this huge project for Manhattan and the area to put all of these, dams up, basically like blockading life from seeing the river in anticipation of this, the next Hurricane Sandy that's anticipated in the next couple of years. And it just starts to feel like a situation where, you're going to the doctor and there's an artery that's clogged, and so you're putting a stent in there to keep it open, or there's like the preservation of the resuscitation of Manhattan or the spaces that we live on, that we've kind of projected these ideas, like we care for these places the way we care for these bodies. And then when my mind goes there, I start to see this, so the through line in all of your work, Shana, problematizing what it is to be in a body.
As you were talking about the stent and that sort of relationship, I started thinking about ground rules, and the way that I never expected the research I was doing into baseball, even though I knew that I wanted that book to use baseball as a metaphor. What I never expected was that the stuff I ended up finding from the umpires would feel so much like talking to the doctors. And I think in thinking about this idea of what becomes a body and the logics that we fall back on or rely on, or the ways that we can conceive of intervening, and also sort of the ways that, at least in sort of many Western cultures, we prioritize intervening over not intervening.
Your work is incredibly research heavy, it seems. And I was wondering, where do you begin? What is your process? And when do you know that you're done?
That's a fantastic question, and I'm grateful for it. So I think I both really like geek out and love researching things. So I can have the problem of being like, I'll just look at some more stuff before I start making anything. So the when I'm done part is maybe a particularly vexing question, but oftentimes I feel like what I end up doing in my work, I don't know, for reasons I don't know exactly, is trying to put things together that don't sort of necessarily go together, right? So thinking about, Manhattan in relationship to queerness, or, my own sort of experience as a trans person, or thinking about baseball and cancer, like those kinds of things. I think in metaphors, and I think it's one of the ways that I try to make sense of things. And so because of that, things stand in for each other all the time. And I think maybe as a visual artist also, images stand in for ideas, and words stand in for images. And so there's like this kind of mix that's always happening, as an idea is starting to come forward. And then I really struggle with not knowing how to actually make them go together in a way that's logical and can make sense outside my head. And that's oftentimes where like form comes in, or other things. But I think to do the research, usually I end up with questions that I just quite literally don't know the answers to. Or I have a question of like, how do these two things go together, and what could I spend time with to try to understand that better? So just using ground rules as an example, I had begun watching a lot of baseball before my mom was sick, but a lot of baseball once she was diagnosed, and we would spend time watching baseball sort of together on separate coasts, and then also when we were physically in the same place. And when she died, I became, I think it's fair to say, completely obsessed. I read every book that she'd ever read about baseball. I read every book I could find about baseball. And for whatever reason, I think I was trying to make sense of this loss through this game that she had loved and that I also had a great affinity for, but I'd never played. And so I remembered that years before, maybe 3 or 4 years before, I'd watched this World Series game where I think a St. Louis Cardinals pitcher threw, I want to say, and maybe I'm exaggerating, but I think threw 12 straight, not 12, 12 straight balls and walked the bases loaded, like consecutive batters. And I wrote this really short little piece about what it must be like when your whole job is to have your body function to do this thing that it then, in this really critical moment, just won't do. And I later learned, that there's a whole sort of literature about in baseball, and I think in other sports, about the yips, which is like not being able to throw the ball or do the thing you're supposed to do, right? Like, but I was running, and badly, really badly. I'm not a good runner, so I was running, and I was like, what does it mean, like, when your body just doesn't do the thing it's supposed to do anymore? And then I was like, that's it. That's how I'm gonna make work about this thing that I've just sort of lived through and experienced, and this way that I can't understand. I'm never gonna know exactly what happened for my mom. Anyway, and so I sat down and I started, making notes and all of this. And I ran out of things really quickly because I have no idea what it feels like to be a baseball player, like none. And I can't really research it. And so the metaphor just like ran short really quickly. But while I was looking at stuff, I started realizing that part of this idea of being able to control outcomes in baseball is not just about bodies, but about the spaces where baseball gets played. And so that gave me a place that I could go, because you can research that till, the end of time. And so I started reading about ballparks. I started reading about statistics. I started reading um, and thinking about what made decision making possible in relationship to those things, and slowly began to realize that what I needed to understand were a few things. I knew that the question in that book, for instance, was about making decisions. And I knew that it was about relationships. And I knew that it was about trying to manage things that are outside your control. But I didn't really know, like, in what way or what order or any of those things. And so I did a few things. I interviewed the person who had been my mom's palliative nurse practitioner, who was amazing, this woman named Molly Bumpus, about decision making in her field and how she thinks about decision making. My partner, Carrie McNeil, connected me with her best friend, who is an emergency room doctor, who let me spend some time with her talking about decision making in emergency care. And then I went on a tour of a bunch of ballparks and was able to get connected through my stepfather's brother, Greg Johns, who was a baseball writer, to baseball park historians who kind of hang out and work either formally or informally in relationship to baseball teams. And so I was able to, like, have all these conversations, and that started to unlock other questions. I realized all of a sudden that weather was really important, and that that the kinds of grass that get used was important, and whether there was a dome or not a dome was important. All of this for this kind of decision making. And then that led me to the Baseball Hall of Fame, where I worked for a couple of weeks at a time, just going through a ton of material. And additionally, I had insights about what to look for there, because I worked with this incredible research assistant who at the time was a PhD student, I think, in anthropology, named Randy Irwin, but who had been a college softball player. And so we were able to have these really amazing conversations about decision making for players and for fields and all of those things. And she pointed me to a series of things that I wouldn't have thought to look at. And that's like how we found the umpire letters and a handful of other things. And through that, I did a ton of reading and note taking and mapping, to your point, Jan. And then I just sit down and write. And that writing sort of took shape slowly but surely into the text that those two texts, for Park Factors and for Ground Rules.
One thing that popped in my head as you were talking is, you know, you're talking about metaphors and you're talking about baseball, and, baseball is also a metaphor for the American dream. And within that, it's a metaphor, you could potentially see this as a metaphor for white supremacy or, capitalism, which relies on white supremacy. There is, we're teasing out a conversation about your work, Shana, and I think all of these ideas are kind of in this large pot of questions that you're asking, between like systems of white supremacy or inequity, living in a body, the continuous problem of living in a body, in a city, in a space. What are the rules? How to interrogate what the rules are using different sort of metaphorical spaces. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I that absolutely does resonate. When I was researching this book, I was self-conscious, that I was basically making a book about the loss of my mom, because losing my mom sucked, and I'm an artist. And so I was making something. And I think I was like, this feels like I'm, making maybe something that's going to be too personal to be useful or effective or interesting even for a broader audience. And, whatever, I was going to make it one way or the other. But as I was doing that research, I was also wrestling, not unlike, wrestling with the sort of romance of thinking about kind of, David Wojnarowicz's sort of particular queer moment in New York City. But in thinking about how it is that this sport that is, really deeply tied to militarism and really deeply tied, as you said, Monica, to white supremacy in the United States, both organized and unorganized white supremacy. I was like, how is this the metaphor for this feeling of like loss and love that I am like, what is the complexity of this being the way that I am thinking about this other story of, nursing my mom as she was dying, or thinking about her own histories in the world. And I hope that it's not too haphazard the way it shows up. But in that research I was doing, mostly into cancer, one of the things I learned from this really great book, The Emperor of All Maladies, was that there are these incredible parallels between the kind of ongoing war making and sort of imperial project of the United States and the quote unquote fight against cancer. And I began to really see how this story that I had was not just about me or my mom or Bob or whatever trying to figure out how to make these impossible decisions when you can't know everything and don't know everything and never will. But it was also about how we do that, in quote unquote America, and what that means in Western medicine, what that means in frankly, in sort of marketing and advertising practices, what it means in sports, and how all of that continues to both inform but also really limit the resources we have to deal with complex things. So I think, there's this thing that people always say about, that people quote unquote battle cancer, or lost their fight, or they fought hard, or all those things. And I think to me, there was something really critical about drawing out this idea that like war is war is always good, and war is the thing that we have, and we have wars to win them, right? Because then when we do that everywhere, that's kind of all that's left. It is also true that, when we imagine that we can conquer everything and that should always be our objective, what we actually can imagine becomes so incredibly limited.
Yeah, that reminds
But
me of um, the AstroTurf discussion in ground rules, like wanting a certain kind of stadium and then creating AstroTurf for it, and then, or wanting a certain kind of stadium and then it affected the grass. Is that correct? And then
Yeah.
putting AstroTurf on top of it because the grass was affected. Like replacing a problem with a problem with a problem.
Well, and what's amazing about that story of AstroTurf, and this is part of like one of the terrible and wonderful things about the research I do for these projects, is that so much doesn't get in. So the AstroTurf was created by Monsanto, which is like essentially a war making and biological sort of industry corporation, and they were developing it to replace grass in, guess where, public housing in Rhode Island.
Oh, yeah.
And that is where it was discovered before it became AstroTurf. So, that I think is what's sort of, coming back to Emily Drabinsky's, like, there are only one or two, we all have one or two good questions that we keep coming at over and over in different ways. Like, these are the kinds of things that it reminds me of, that like, the project of undoing white supremacy and undoing capitalism is one that we can begin to see and imagine and come at in creative new ways, from seeing the ways these things are interlocking and not just being devastated by them.
Thinking about the baseball metaphor in the wake of your mom's passing, it just makes me think that it also has to do with love too, because your mom loved baseball for her reasons, and you didn't love baseball it sounds like, when she was alive, and you didn't share. It wasn't like a love that you guys shared. And then she was gone, and you don't have your mom anymore, and baseball exists, and it was something that she loved. And sometimes when we lose people, we can, there's something to be said about the space we can create for ourselves through understanding or building a relationship with the things that they loved.
I did love baseball while she was alive, but I think that I came to watch baseball in the way that I did. Yeah, exactly, because it was a thing that we could share that was every day. When we lived far away from one another, and it was something that I'd always really like. I grew up watching sports, and so I always appreciated baseball and I enjoyed it. But when my mom got sick, it became something that we could talk about, and it meant that we could start having conversations about the players, about the games themselves. And I say this in the text of Ground Rules, but it became a way to talk every day about something that wasn't cancer. But that had the same kind of regularity. And yeah, I think after she died, it became something that I could maintain with her even when she was gone. And it wasn't the only thing, but it was a big thing. And in a weird way, it was hers and my thing. And that, I think, was helpful.
My last question, Shana, is what are you working on now?
So right now, I'm working on two things. Well, three really. One is trying to find more time to make stuff. But I just bought a C&P 12-inch by 18-inch press, which is my first press of my own.
Wow.
And I am really excited and a little bit terrified to say that I think I'm trying to start up a little print shop.
Yeah.
I don't quite know what that means yet. I think I want to be collaborating with people. I think I want to be putting some political work out into the world. I feel like we need to be reading things and sharing strategies. I think we're in a pretty scary moment in the world that's not, necessarily that much more scary than other moments that I've lived through, and yet also does feel dire. And I want to work with people who are trying to put stuff out in the world to help be that person who gets it out in the world. So I don't know exactly what that means yet. But I did just get this press, which I'm really excited about, and I'm excited to get that up and running. And in the meantime, I've been auditioning Ground Rules, which takes a really long time. I'm down to about 8 hours a book to make those. And then I have this woodcut that I'm working on that's like this weird remnant of the baseball projects and that research that is right now an image that might become a book. I'm not sure. I'll have to show it to you all and get your feedback, but it involves the connection between the Houston Astrodome and Shea Stadium and the idea that we were talking about before of sort of U.S. imperialism and suburbanization in the early 1960s when those two ball fields were constructed.
Oh my God. That's amazing. Well, thank you, Shana, so much. This has been incredible.
I also just want to say thank you so much to you all for having me and for these excellent questions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you to our audience for joining us for another episode of Booklyn Calling. We'll be sure to add a lot of links and fun things in the show notes of the things that we've discussed. You can always reach out to us to questions if we forgot anything or if you want to know more about anything that Shana discussed. And as always, if you're a librarian or a curator and you work at an educational institution and you're interested in collecting Shana's work or other works like it in our catalog, you can email us at hello@booklyn.org. That's spelled like Brooklyn, but no R. And you can always check out our entire collection of artist books on Booklyn's website. See you next time. This podcast was made possible in part by funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs and in partnership with the City Council, and from individual donors to Booklyn Inc. You can support this podcast by making a donation at booklyn.org/donate.